We got up in the morning. We were on our way to synagogue. By 7 a.m., you could hear the missile fall in Israel. Thump, 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 thump. And you don't get sirens unless the missiles are targeting your specific area. But for at least an hour before there were missiles aimed at Jerusalem, we could hear the missiles falling in the coast. And the astonishing thing was that you didn't hear Air Force. Okay, because usually if there's missile fire, then the Air Force is scrambled and they take out the missile launchers, the people who are doing it. As religious Jews, we didn't have the television on or our telephones, during a holiday or the Sabbath. We can't use electronic devices, but we all knew we were in the middle of a war. The only thing we couldn't understand was why we could only hear the enemy and we couldn't hear ourselves.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me. This is our penultimate episode of the season, and it couldn't be with a better thinker, person, friend. Today we had on Dr. Yoram Hazony, who is a chairman of National Conservatism Conference and the Edmund Burke Foundation, our new partner at American Moment on all things national conservatism. But before I get to that, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org. There you can find everything that we have cooking as an organization, all the backlog of this show. If you've got holiday travel, we can certainly suffuse your time in the car with many hundreds of hours of my dulcet tones. You can find applications for all of our various programs, including AM Fridays, the Fellowship for American Statecraft, and all sorts of other things. If you want to get involved, go to AmericanMoment.org/join. Fill out that form, and one of our team members will reach out to you, and we'll talk about how to get you involved in the fight here in Washington. You can donate money to us, lots of money. This is December. I need to raise money at AmericanMoment.org/donate. Today we had on Dr. Yoram Hazony, who we've had on before. I highly encourage you to check out the previous episode that we did because it goes back into some of his biographical information and some of what his earlier career was like. But we dived straight in this time on what is going on in Israel. I saw Dr. Hazony 2 days after the war began here in Washington, D.C., as we were starting to plan out this partnership between our two organizations. And it's been this odd blessing to be able to talk to someone who's so close to the situation on the ground. His son serving in the armed forces over there. Would encourage all of you to be praying for them and really the whole country of Israel as it fights off these degenerate barbarians that seem anti-civilizational in their aspirations. But we talked about that. We talked about what's going on with free speech on college campuses. Is there any merit to this criticism that the right is hypocrites because they now don't like Hamas protests on campus? Talked about what's going on with these liberal Jewish billionaires and how they're responding to all of this, and also the future of our partnership between American Moment and National Conservatism. I thought it was a fantastic episode. Be sure to check out all of Dr. Hazony's work, including for the real nerds in the audience. I recently been getting glowing reviews from friends of mine of his biblical scholarship as well. He has a book on the book of Esther that comes very highly recommended. So check that out. I'm functionally literate, so I don't know anything about that, but we'll go now to our conversation with Dr. Yoram Hazony. Dr. Hazony, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Good morning. How much did you sleep last night?
For those who don't know, Dr. Hazony and I have been on the road, part of a new collaboration. We'll talk more about that later. And so it's been a lot of late nights and early mornings, and this is one of them. I got plenty of sleep. You can sleep when you're dead, and that's my general approach when it comes to this stuff. We've had you on the podcast before. Many of our guests are very familiar with your scholarship and your background, and so we're going to dive straight in. You came to the States for a visit 2 days after the war between Israel and Gaza began. Tell us what it was like on the ground that day and what has happened since in this sort of stepwise chronological way, because I think so few people hear it from to use the proverbial term, the horse's mouth, as it were. What exactly happened on that day?
Well, you That day was Simchat Torah, which is it's the last of the Jewish high holidays, we got up in the morning. We were on our way to synagogue, and you could hear by 7 a.m. you could hear the missile fall in Israel, thump, 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 thump. And you don't get sirens unless the missiles are targeting your specific area. But for at least an hour before there were missiles aimed at Jerusalem, we could hear the missiles falling in the coast. And the astonishing thing was that you didn't hear Air Force, okay? Because usually, if there's missile fire, then the Air Force is scrambled and they take out the missile launchers, the people who are doing it, or at least drive them out of operation. And we spent the whole day with sirens and going to bomb shelters and in between listening to missiles falling, and there was no Air Force. So as religious Jews, we didn't have the television on or our telephones, during a holiday or the Sabbath. We can't use electronic devices, but we all knew we were in the middle of a war. The only thing we couldn't understand was why we could only hear the enemy and we couldn't hear ourselves. So that was pretty eerie, and it turns out that the whole story from then until today is for sure is nightmarish. And I think Americans probably are familiar with the nature of the war. We're fighting an enemy that doesn't really have military bases. You'll tend to think that there's civilian parts of the country, and then there's where the military is. But Hamas, which is our local Muslim Brotherhood chapter, it doesn't really have military bases. They have their extraordinarily intricate military terrorist complex built into civilian homes and hospitals and schools and mosques in those buildings and under them. So it's terrible for the population. The Arab population living in Gaza and Khan Yunis to the south. It's a nightmare. And for us, it's also a nightmare. Nobody wants to be conducting a war, no matter how well justified, in densely populated areas. And Israel has been trying to get most of the population to move out of the battle areas, and we've been releasing maps that show you in detail where the fighting is, so that people can move to other parts of Gaza. But it's difficult from all sides, and of course we still, even after a week of temporary ceasefire in which 80 some hostages were released, we still have over 100 hostages who are being held. We don't know if they're alive or not, because the Red Cross isn't allowed to visit them. Some of the hostages who were released report that the hostages are being tortured, which is, of course, part of the attempt to demoralize Israelis. It's not really working. I mean, it's really pretty remarkable to take the temperature of just about any part of Israeli society right now. The degree of unity is overwhelming. No people, are. This is one of those classical situations where, the nation is threatened and everybody understands the threat. There's no argument about what the threat is. The war in Gaza is one aspect of the war, but there's a war taking place on the Lebanese border. There's missile fire now coming from Syria, from Yemen. And with this degree of threat, and of course looming the possibility of major war with Hezbollah and Iran, with this degree of threat, Israel's mobilized more than 500,000 soldiers. That means that pretty much everybody who's my age has children who are in the fighting. We have one son in Gaza. We have another son who is in a unit that specializes on the Golan Heights. He was just called and is serving there because of the threat from Syria. And of course, many, we have nephews and nieces and cousins. So it's a difficult and painful and complicated time, but it would be wrong to miss that our forces, like all of these young men and women, are extremely. They're in very good spirits. You don't think that you can be in good spirit going to war, but the feeling of unity, the feeling of brotherhood, the feeling that your cause is just, that everyone understands, at least in Israel, everyone understands what the cause is, and that it's just, and that's reflected also in the fact that we have a unity government running the war. So it is a Netanyahu-led government, and he's the prime minister, and he's our senior statesman. But he has ministers in his war cabinet who are from the former opposition, left of center ministers. General Eisenkot is one of them. His son was killed in battle in Gaza yesterday. And that's it. It's a small country facing overwhelming challenges. But, tonight is the second night of Hanukkah. And all of us are raised on the stories of the Jews being able to miraculously pull off a victory where it looked like it wasn't so likely.
So tell me a little bit about how the domestic mood in Israel compares with the domestic mood during previous conflicts or major attacks from Hamas. I mean, is this qualitatively different than those previous incidences?
Yeah, it's very different because the people may not remember Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. And when I say pulled out, I mean that the last Israeli soldier was removed from the Gaza Strip, and the last Jewish civilian was removed from the Gaza Strip. All of the homes of Jews who had made their lives in Gaza were bulldozed, and I think the majority of Israelis expected that we would not be in Gaza again. I mean, I don't think it's because people were necessarily so naive as to believe that Gaza was going to turn into the Singapore of the Mediterranean, like the Americans and the Europeans were promising. But we'd all been hearing. I mean, I've always been a skeptic about Palestinian state, but we'd all been hearing for a generation that if you only give the Palestinians a state, then the conflict will somehow be solved. But we pulled out in 2005. In 2006, there were elections in Gaza, and Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, won the elections. People talk about it as a totalitarian kind of organization, and that's certainly a correct way to view it. But Hamas won the elections in Gaza fair and square, and the Americans who had been pressing to have these elections. Elections are sort of, there are Americans who think elections are a panacea and they solve all problems, and the Americans who were stunned that Hamas would win the elections, spent months working to try to orchestrate some kind of maneuver to prevent the elections from for the will of the voters of Gaza from being implemented, and that failed. By 2007, Hamas had massacred the PLO fighters who the Americans wanted to be in charge, and so we've had 16 years of 18 years of an independent Palestinian state in Gaza, and 16 years of rule by Hamas, by the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. Billions of dollars in Western and Arab world aid have been funneled there. We have some idea of where the money went because 3 of Hamas's leaders live in Qatar and are reported to, among them, have $12 billion in assets in the bank. And there's at least $1 billion of tunnels under Gaza, which are one of the principal instruments that they use in the warfare against us. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is that during those 18 years of independent Palestinian state in Gaza, there was more or less nonstop violence. Everybody's seen the images of missiles being fired at Israel, and that went on for 16 years. There were many Israeli incursions, larger or smaller. There were 2 full-scale wars, limited wars in the sense that Israel's goal was not to destroy Hamas, but just to punish it and try to restrain it from for firing at our population centers. There were extreme voices. When I say extreme, I mean I'm not saying that they were unreasonable, but just there were fringe voices throughout this period. Everybody in Israel remembers that there were politicians who blamed Netanyahu and the government for not going in and dismantling Hamas. And whatever the merits of the argument, the truth is that Netanyahu wasn't in a position to go in and destroy Hamas because he didn't have the support of the population. Most Israelis did not want to be in Gaza. Anybody who served in the IDF, in the Israel Defense Forces in the 1980s and 1990s, remembers what it was like to soldier in Gaza. And it's not pleasant. You don't feel like doing it. You don't feel like getting in a Jeep and patrolling up and down and enforcing a curfew, on people who hate you. And you don't want to do it. You want to do other things with your life. But
did you do that when you were younger?
I did. I did 18 years of reserve duty. Most of my service was in the West Bank, but there were a few days where I was actually stationed in Gaza, guarding the post office or something. And you don't want to do it. Nobody in Israel, almost no one in Israel, wanted to reach the conclusion that Israel had to reoccupy Gaza. But at this point, there's wall-to-wall agreement about it, and we'll see how the whole thing unfolds. I think our biggest challenge is not military. Our biggest challenge is the Biden administration, which, on the one hand, everybody in Israel is grateful for the plane loads of munitions resupplying the Israeli military effort. On the other hand, every morning, a military supply aircraft leaves the U.S. for Israel, and every afternoon somebody walks out of the White House or the State Department and makes some completely make some kind of a statement that there's going to be a Palestinian state in Gaza, or that the PLO, which is claiming credit for the massacres of October 7th and 8th, should be brought back into Gaza, or that Israel should use smaller bombs, or that Israel should fight without civilian casualties. And I understand that some of this is, it's the internal politics of the Democratic Party. I mean, they have a problem. They have half of their voters are sympathetic to Hamas and to the Muslim Brotherhood side of the war. So they're somewhat constrained as well. But even taking that into account, I mean, the Americans are facing a brick wall in terms of Israeli consensus. The latest poll says that there's 8%. That was 8% of the Israeli public that supports the Biden administration's plan of bringing the PLO into Gaza and giving them an independent state. So that's just not going to go anywhere. And so, frankly, our greatest challenge is balancing between military aims, which are clear and necessary, and on which just about the entire Israeli public agrees, and the problem that Biden is facing re-election, and he's lobbying Israel for all sorts of strange things.
So let's talk about other political constituencies in the United States. I mean, it seems like everyone on the right of center in the United States got very frothy and excited to, call for this, that, or the other in terms of response to Hamas's attack. What have you made of the response from the American right as the war has begun?
Well, look, the American right has been interesting. I mean, on the one hand, Americans, American nationalists, or American conservatives, are most of them have an instinctive and very deep connection to Israel, which is based on the biblical inheritance and a long time alliance between the United States and Israel. But on the other hand, as the whole idea of foreign alliances, foreign entanglements for the American right has become problematic and justifiably so. Since the Berlin Wall, the United States has often acted as though it has unlimited power and can simply, reshape the globe into a new world order, where there's going to be, as George H.W. Bush memorably put it, replacing the law of the jungle with the rule of law. So the whole globe is going to be the rule of law, and America is going to be the world's policeman. And the results of that, as we know, have been catastrophic. Not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in Libya and in Egypt and in Syria, and so the idea that Washington is capable of exerting force around the globe, certainly in the Middle East and in Muslim countries. That idea that Americans can do this intelligently and successfully, I think it's been disproved over and over and over again. And so, those people who are, watching the war in Ukraine and watching as America, which, really the White House in terms of foreign policy, its main job should be focusing on China. America has one strategic rival, that's China. And to watch over the last 2 years the way that the United States has, misdirected its attention to, a war that's a very important war for Europeans, but less important for Americans. And, the fact that the Biden administration, sits there every day, micro-planning what's going to happen on the battlefield in Ukraine. That's scary to conservatives. And now the Gaza war comes along, And by the way, it's not. I mean, this is not a Democrat-Republican thing. It's true that the Biden White House sits there every day trying to figure out, where Israel should deploy its troops and how they should use them and what techniques they should use and what they shouldn't use. And they're on the phone talking with Israel. And every time that they pick up the phone to Israel, they're not thinking about China. And this is true of Republicans as well. Mike Pence, when he was running for president, he said something like, if I were president, I'd be in the Situation Room right now working on scenarios for rescuing the hostages. And Mike Pence is a good guy. I know he loves Israel, but he's completely not able to understand the job of the president of the United States. The Trump doctrine was a theory of how the United States could reduce its involvement in all sorts of wars around the globe, and the main concept was that America has to have the kind of allies that are not like a protectorate, or a dependency, not the kinds of allies that are they're allies, meaning that the United States has a responsibility to send its soldiers to protect them and to fund their wars. That's not an ally. The Trump administration's view of what an ally is that allies are supposed to be able to put in enough, both financially, not 1 or 2%, but 5 or 6% of GDP, turning themselves into a serious fighting force capable of projecting power, and on the other hand, a personal investment in making your country powerful, which means that you're at least your sons, maybe your daughters, also serve in the armed forces, and there are countries in Europe. I mean, I think most notably Poland, that wants to be that kind of an ally, the kind of ally that could defend itself, and where where the Americans would not have to send their own forces because the Poles would be strong enough. Poland, the UK, India, Australia, Japan. There are a number of countries that could be that kind of an ally, where they're so strong, where they build themselves up to be so strong that they're actually capable of contributing something to American interests, rather than just being a burden. Israelis see themselves in that way, and I know Israel may not be perfect in every aspect of it, but the Israelis have absolutely no interest in American troops. I mean, that's Israeli military doctrine going back 75 years. The reason the state of Israel exists is so that we Jews can defend ourselves. So there is no parallel between Ukraine and Israel as far as I'm concerned, because the first thing that the Ukrainians want is to join NATO, which means that America needs to send its army to the front. And Israel doesn't want U.S. forces. So for the American right, I think that there's a little bit of thinking through that needs to be done. Israel is not Ukraine, and Israel, the war in Gaza is not the war in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And what Israel needs from the United States is much more like the kind of help that Reagan gave Margaret Thatcher during the Falklands War. The Falklands War in 1983, nobody believed that Britain had the military capacity to project power over 8,000 miles to the Falklands. And of course, America could have simply, conquered the Falklands and handed them to the British. But Reagan saw farther, and he saw that, what he really wanted out of this was not the Falklands. What he wanted out of this was that Margaret Thatcher would emerge as a powerful leader, and that Britain would reemerge as a powerful country, capable of contributing something as an actual ally. And so notice not sending U.S. troops, but helping making sure that munitions are resupplied, that giving diplomatic cover at the United Nations and elsewhere. Those are real contributions that Reagan made, but it was up to the Brits to win or lose that war. And I think that's the right model for America's allies going forward. And I hope Israel can be a good ally to the United States that way.
So the American domestic response to this war has had a lot of facets to it, but one of the most interesting things going on is the response by some of the wealthiest people in America to what's going on in our universities. Now, look, I can get just as frustrated as anyone that there's a lot of Johnny-come-lately here, and the substantive critiques that these people have of these universities are worth examining and perhaps critiquing as well in certain angles. But tell me what you've made of this response where, major donors to American colleges are looking and seeing that they are utterly infected with, this anti-Israel worldview that borders on genocidal. What do you make of all of it?
I think the first important thing to see is that the current wave of woke neo-Marxist plus radical Islamic revolutionary fervor on the campuses and in the streets of many American and European cities. First thing to notice is that this is a repeat of the George Floyd riots from 2020. We remember that George Floyd was an excuse that was used to conduct 6 months of urban rioting, semi-warfare in some cases, where the goal was to get the goal of the revolutionary left was to put systemic racism on the agenda as something that no one in the United States could ignore. Right? That was their goal. Their goal was to say, look, there's systemic racism. If you don't deal with it, primarily by electing Biden instead of Trump, but if you don't deal with systemic racism, we're going to make your lives complete hell. We're going to make this country completely dysfunctional, which they did a pretty good job of. And, I had actually thought the whole time that was happening, I thought Americans want law and order. There's going to be a law and order backlash. They'll reelect Trump, but that's not what happened. What happened is that the American public caved. The American public said, we just want quiet. Biden will get the riots to stop as soon as he's elected. So they voted for Biden, and that's exactly what happened. Now, so flash forward 3 years, we're now watching the same exact playbook being organized and funded by the same people. We're watching the same playbook, except instead of systemic racism, the slogan is genocide in Palestine. And it's exactly the same model. In the first round in 2020, the oppressor was whiteness. White Americans, Christian Americans, conservative Americans. That was the oppressor who was being delegitimized and expelled from civilized society in America as illegitimate. Now we're doing the same thing, and it's interesting that they've taken the genocide in Palestine, genocide in Gaza slogan, and they are using it as an extension of the war in Israel to delegitimize and expel Jews from, they call all Jews Zionists often, but they're talking about all the major Jewish organizations in America and Jewish communities, Jewish students and professors on the campuses. And it's part of the same exact revolution as what we've been seeing for years. One of the things that makes it interesting is that, as you know, the majority of Jews in the United States and in Europe are liberals. And I want to be clear. I myself have never been a liberal, not for 5 minutes. I grew up in a home where liberalism was not considered a reasonable worldview for Jews or for anybody else. So I'm a non-liberal from birth. But most American Jews are liberals. I understand that this isn't always easy for everyone to understand, especially if they're not Jewish. That for the most part, liberal Jews live with this kind of false consciousness where they think that liberalism is actually going to be good for Jews, and for many decades, it was possible to make that argument. I didn't believe it, but people believed it. And now all of a sudden, it's turning out that the lefty allies that many of these liberal Jews have spent their lives with, many of them are just Hamas supporters. They, when they hear genocide the Jews, or when they see actual acts of murder, dismemberment, gang rape, torture of a kind and a cruelty that has been surpassed nowhere. When they see these things, they look around. As Jews, they feel pain, and they look around and they see that many of their friends are Hamas supporters, and they thought that their liberal friends, their progressive friends, were moral, decent people, and that they were all, we liberal Jews are working with the liberal Christians and the other liberals, and we're bringing, peace to the world and justice to the world with our liberalism. Now suddenly they've discovered that what they're bringing with their liberalism is an openness to having the Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood at the table. And when you have terrorists who aspire to mass murder at the table, you have to accommodate them, and that's what's happening at these universities. Is that the woke neo-Marxist alliance, which includes radical Islam as an integral, crucial part of that alliance, that's taken over the universities. And after 2020, after the Cultural Revolution of 2020, the universities are under the thumb of the woke neo-Marxists and their radical Islamic allies. And we just saw it on television this week. Three university professors, presidents of universities from Harvard and Penn and MIT, unable to accept the idea that having thousands of students marching through your campus, calling for genocide of Jews, they're unable to see that as being, harassment of the Jewish and or Israeli students on the campus. I think that should tell Americans everything that they need to know. I don't expect Americans necessarily to always be looking out for the interests of Jews as Jews, but I do think that that America is facing something that we haven't seen in our lifetimes, which is an organized pro-genocide organization, which at the moment is fanning the flames of Jew hatred all across the United States and in Britain and in Europe. But let's not be stupid about this. It's not going to stop with the Jews. Before they took on the Jews, they took on the straight white males, and they're not going to stop until they delegitimize and expel all of us.
So that's actually a useful segue, because there's a bunch of sort of adjacent critiques to part of this response that have been percolating. One of which is that all of the anti-woke, pro-free speech people were hypocrites. That we've been talking for years about safe spaces on campus, and now the pro-Israel right wants safe spaces, and it was never a principled stand. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, the problem as almost always with the American right is people need to decide whether. I'm talking about people on the right. They need to decide whether they are liberals or whether they're conservatives. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's plenty of people who call themselves the right, and they're anti-woke, but their worldview is liberal, and so they have this illusion that there's such a thing as absolute free speech, and or an absolute right to demonstrate. And if you're a conservative, which is to say that you're actually a realist about politics. Liberals are not realists about politics. Liberalism is about designing a utopia in which everyone gets to say what they want, or everyone gets perfectly equal treatment. Everyone is perfectly free, no matter what they espouse. Conservatives are realists. Real conservatives are realists. And a realist says, well, it was all very nice and good to be defending an absolute right of freedom of speech. But by the way, I've never defended an absolute right of freedom of speech. But I understand people saying, look, let's just let everybody say whatever they want to say. Well, guess what? That's not always realistic. It's realistic in a country, in a society where everybody respects one another enough, even if they hate one another. They respect one another enough to stay within the guidelines of democratic procedures, peaceful transitions of government. You have debates. One side says what they think, the other side says what they think, and then you vote. Right? All of that's beautiful when it works, but we are dealing now with an opponent. I mean, I would say an enemy, because they declare themselves to be our enemies. We're dealing now with an enemy that uses a democracy and uses the old liberal regime in order to build a power base for a violent fascist movement whose goal is the violent overthrow of the American Constitution and the American way of life. And I don't know how much more evidence people need of that, but it is absolutely not the case, I say as a conservative, that America simply needs, because it's been a liberal country, simply needs to say every freedom that is guaranteed to good liberals and good conservatives who participate in the democratic system, every such freedom also needs to be given to terrorist organizations, which organize teach-ins and educational efforts to advance the cause of genocide against Jews, against whites, against whoever it is who's going to stand in their way. And we need to treat them as though they are the normal participants in the democratic process. They are not normal participants. And if we treat them as normal participants, then we're going to lose America, and we're going to lose Britain, and we're going to lose every country that decides that liberalism means that people who are trying to kill you, who are trying to destroy you, and have proved it amply, are just legitimate participants in the dialogue.
So a second criticism that's been levied is that, a lot of, let's just take, for example, these sort of center-left Jewish billionaires that are getting up in arms about what's going on college campuses. They never had a commensurate response when there was systematic abuse and hatred towards whites on campus over the last 50 years, which has been extremely prevalent as well. And that, frankly, I also think that it would be accurate to say that the unique phenomenon of sort of American left-wing anti-Semitism is a correlated phenomenon to their anti-white hatred as well. It all stems from a very similar worldview that they have. Do you think that's a fair criticism? Why are they caring now and they didn't care before?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the point of the criticism is. I mean, we know that there are people who disagree with us. We know that there are people who as NatCons, that there's lots and lots of parts of American society that are not terribly interested in our friendship. We don't get invited to their get-togethers, and we don't get invited to their platforms, and we don't get to publish books with their publishers. I mean, we know for sure that there are lots of people who don't like us. There's lots of people who disagree with us. Okay, so here we have a moment in which all sorts of I'm focusing about liberal Jews. It's just, I know that community very well. I think the same is going to be true for other liberals, for liberal Catholics and liberal Protestants, but let's stay focused on liberal Jews. We have a moment here where a lot of very wealthy, very powerful people are suddenly waking up to something. And there's a minute where they seem to be open to parts of our worldview, maybe to all of our worldview. We don't know where this is going to go. And I'm sort of confused about people who want to sit around and talk about, oh, you didn't help us before. Well, we know they didn't help us before. We know they were liberals. I mean, like, what's the surprise there? The surprise is that you get a liberal Jewish billionaire like AmCanon. The surprise is that that he's tweeting that he regrets that he didn't speak up when straight white males were being persecuted. Now, that's a surprise. But so when you meet with Mr. AmCanon, are you going to say, "Listen, I'm just so amazed that you weren't as smart as I was all of those years"? Like, is that what you have to say, or are you going to be serious politically and say, we're not in the greatest shape here? Anybody who wants to join our side, in part or in whole, we should be encouraging them, right? I mean, like, what is politics about? It's not about saying "I told you so." It's about building an alliance that's strong enough to be able to defeat our enemies. Come on.
That seems obvious to me. Speaking of being serious politically, it seems that across the world, whether it's in Europe, in the United States, even in parts of Asia, national conservatism is more popular than ever. Give us your 10,000-foot survey of the landscape and what the future of that movement with a registered trademark, so to speak, might be looking like.
Look, as you know, national conservatism has, there's a lot of different issues that are important to us. At the very center of national conservatism is reviving and building up the idea of the independent nation, which is something that over the last 30 years of globalism has. A lot of people have forgotten the importance of the nation. The idea of the nation as an independent political entity, a sovereign entity, is one in which different nations have different, they have different characters, they have different historical traditions, different constitutional traditions and legal systems, different religions, and of course different languages, and the idea that these nations need they need to be able to pass their own laws. They need to, according to their interests. They need to be able to protect their borders according to their interests, and I think that issue of the border, more than anything else. There's many things wrong with liberalism, and I've written a couple of books about what's wrong with liberalism. There's many things wrong with it, but I think that the part that most immediately convinces people is the fact that liberalism does not have, as a political theory, doesn't have the resources to be able to explain why we have borders. It does not have the resources. Once you say all human beings are perfectly free and perfectly equal, which is what Locke says, once you say that, then how can you justify closing your border to foreigners? Like, if they're perfectly free, then they're perfectly free to cross your border. If they're perfectly equal, then they're perfectly equal to be citizens in the United States, just like you are. And it's a utopian worldview, and people are becoming more realistic. As they see that their country is being inundated with foreigners, and in particular now the immigration from Muslim countries. People were so angry at Trump for wanting to put a temporary moratorium on immigration from countries from which there's a terrorist threat. And so now the West has many millions of Muslims, and of course some of these Muslims are perfectly decent people, and they're excellent citizens, and they're good friends. But the reality of an immigrant Muslim population of millions, in which, as I understand it from the polling data, that there's something like 50% support for the massacres on October 7th and October 8th, and that the conditions in which a substantial part of an immigrant community is siding with the enemies of our civilization and supporting murder and genocide. Those conditions are conditions that are pushing lots of people towards nationalism. They are pushing them towards national conservatism, and that's obviously what we saw in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders' stunning political breakthrough, and we're seeing it in other countries. It makes sense. I hope people go deeper into national conservatism than simply to become opponents of unlimited immigration or immigration from particular countries. That there's so much more to talk about, but that has created a political moment in which we're going to be picking up a great deal, many new NatCons from the shock of the shock of Muslim immigration and the role that it is playing in energizing the woke neo-Marxist left.
And as part of helping implement that, we're going to be working a lot more together. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about our new partnership and what the future of the national conservatism movement might look like?
Well, the national conservatism conferences, which are the most, I think, the most visible expression of this burgeoning new political philosophical constellation on the right. These conferences have been, we've been running them for 5 years at this point, and there've been 4 in the United States and 4 in Europe, and it's been highly visible, and I think that's a major contribution. I think you and American Moment have also been making a major contribution. Your role until now has been mostly focused on identifying young people who are capable of staffing everything in Washington, pretty much, right? From the Congress to the White House to media and think tanks and other nonprofits, and that's a crucial piece of what needs to be done. But I think both of our organizations have reached a stage of maturity. You've reached a stage of maturity. We've reached a stage of old age. And conservatism is about an intergenerational project. And I'm absolutely thrilled to about you're joining Edmund Burke Foundation as executive director on top of your other responsibilities. And I'm hoping to see, what do they say in Europe, an ever closer union between the Edmund Burke Foundation and the National Conservatism conferences and American Moment. I think it's the right move at the right time.
I couldn't agree more. It's already been a lot of fun. I'm sure one day there'll be a great sketch comedy show about our road trips. The terrorist grocery store will be the first episode. I think that'll make a great pilot. Anyone wants to hear that story, you can ask me over drinks at some point in the next few months. Dr. Hazony, where can people keep up with all of your public commentary and everything that you're working on?
Easiest just to find me on Twitter, Y Hazony, YH.
I feel like you've been tweeting a lot more lately. Is that true?
What's happening is that I spent since 2016. So I mean, it's basically 8 years working on national conservatism. We're working on helping build up nationalist movements in the United States and in Britain and in Europe. And, the nature of my responsibilities as, like a political theorist and a movement organizer was that I did not, I just didn't talk or write or think very much about Israel, which is my country where I live. I'm a U.S. citizen, but, I live in Israel. I served in the Israeli military. My kids serve in the military. And I've felt like Israel was in pretty good shape. And my responsibility and my loyalty was to America and Europe and to my friends in these other countries who really needed more nationalism and more conservatism. Mm-hmm. Since October 7th, things have changed for me. I mean, I don't feel like I can stand by and pretend like I'm an international figure, and so I don't owe my country anything. Nationalists aren't like that, and now my country Israel is in serious danger, and everybody needs to know. Every Israeli, every Jew needs to do what they can. So I'm tweeting more because I for the moment I have to focus a good piece of my attention to explaining Israel and Jews and Judaism and the war to a world that really wants the answers. They're asking the questions. I need to answer them, but I hope that the war won't go on forever, and we'll be able to do more productive things than tweeting.
Well, and in addition to all the very serious, patriotic and intelligent things that appear on your Twitter feed, there was also an exchange with John Podhoretz that's very funny. I highly recommend, if anyone's looking for something to amuse them late into the evening, they could.
But I didn't name John Podhoretz.
I know. John Podhoretz, Kool-Aid man, bursts through the brick wall and
he's rips off his mask and says, "Oh, that schmuck that Yoram was writing about? That was me. Let me elaborate."
Sorry, I can't help it. I have so many bets with friends of mine every time he says that he's going to stop tweeting, and he just never does. It's so funny. Dr. Hazony, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
hopefully you enjoyed that. Be sure to go to nationalconservatism.org to see everything that we have cooking on that side of the house, and then americanmoment.org for everything on this side of the house. Thank you guys as always for listening. We're always extraordinarily grateful. It's funny. All of our guests that come on this show, they can look at the numbers that these episodes get on our various platforms. It's not exactly the millions of people, but they're always very surprised by the sheer quantity of people around Washington that come up and say, I just saw you on Moment of Truth. It sort of scares and baffles them. So keep doing that. That's very funny to me in particular. Be sure to check out all of our programming on our website at americanmoment.org. Be sure to rate and review this podcast, subscribe on YouTube. Be sure to sign up on our website. We'll be doing more live podcast events next year if you want to join for any of those. Thank you guys as always for listening. We will see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to americanmoment.org to learn more.